Hello, my name is Jody Birchfield, and I am an amateur radio operator. This is an example of an amateur or ham radio. I have been a ham radio enthusiast for many years. I was first licensed in 1995, and here is my current license. It shows my call sign. That's the unique license identifier issued by the FCC to users of ham radio bandwidth spectrum. Got on my shirt as well. I'm not alone. The number of amateur licensees in the United States is 725,000, according to Jason Pfeiffer in the March 2015 Popular Mechanics. The problem I wanted to speak to you today about is that the service, the amateur radio service, is losing its bandwidth allocations. Now, radio spectrum portions are being removed from amateur use for commercial reasons, commercial purposes being sold to the highest bidder. The range of wavelengths or frequencies over which electromagnetic radiation extends is known as the electromagnetic spectrum. I'll just call it spectrum because that's a big word. It includes the wavelengths that we can hear, like the audible sounds, the ones we can see, the visible light portions. It also includes ones we cook with, such as microwaves, ones that we use for medical purposes, diagnoses and treatment, such as x-rays and gamma rays. And in Army Communicator, Wellman and Hahn, in June of 2014, said this about the spectrum. It is not only important to our military forces and federal agencies, but it's an economically critical resource used by commercial companies around the world. Well, you may wonder exactly what's happening to the spectrum. Well, it's being reallocated or sold to commercial interests by the Federal Communications Commission for other new communication methods. Now, Kidd and Rossow in the April 2011 edition of the periodical CHIPS tells us that each time a new form of communication is introduced, space on the spectrum must be available to be licensed by the FCC for exclusive use. That means they have to get the spectrum allocation from somewhere to give it to the new communication methods. If you wonder who the current users of the spectrum are, well, it's used by broadcast television, broadcast radio, as well as some of the newer technologies you may be familiar with, such as Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, cellular voice, and cellular data. One question may be what happens when hams have no spectrum to use. Well, to use a sports analogy, if your team doesn't have a practice field, your game performance is going to suffer. By the same token, no place on the spectrum to practice will seriously degrade amateur performance when it counts. So what exactly do hams use the spectrum for? Well, emergency communications for disasters, for one. Orescio tells us in a periodical titled Emergency Communications, appropriately enough, in October of 2014, that volunteers provide technical services that are used when normal means of communication are overwhelmed or unavailable. What does unavailable possibly mean? Well, it's usually a power outage or a natural disaster limiting or destroying normal communications. Some examples are blizzards, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, floods, even man-made brownouts. Well, why can hams help in these situations? Well, hams are trained and practiced in radio operation and message relay when commercial power is unavailable. Most have battery banks, generators, and even solar or wind power sources to use in emergency situations. Hams also offer public service communications for civic events. Some examples are fundraising walks, festivals, and concerts. Also, sporting events such as biking and running, Ironman, triathlon, and even off-road racing events make use of the communication skills of the amateur service. Hams also assist the National Weather Service data collection and reporting efforts. They participate in storm spotting and severe weather data collection. That is pretty much the collection of hail sizes, wind speeds, damage, rainfall rates and totals. They also assist with the damage assessments and reporting of the aftermath of severe weather. This helps to expedite the insurance verification and claims processing, as well as allocation of disaster funding from federal and state agencies. So, you see, hams have several important roles to fulfill, from emergency communications to public ambassadors, and they need to keep their allocated bandwidth to do them. To eliminate, or at the very least slow the rate which the bandwidth allocations are being reassigned from amateur service, I propose a three-pronged attack. First, spread the word about the importance of emergency communications and the amateur service's role in it. Second, petition Congress and the Federal Communications Commissioners to preserve the bandwidth already allocated to the amateur service. They're not asking for an expansion, just a preservation of what is already theirs by law. Lastly, if you're interested, or think you might be, investigate the hobby. Look into a local club meeting. Check out a license class. Get involved with the events undertaken by local clubs. The Amateur Radio Emergency Service, also known as ARES, perhaps even the military affiliate radio service known as MARS. Radio amateurs love to mentor, or in ham speak, Elmer, those new to the hobby, and you can even participate in things known as contests, which are point contests over the radio. You can participate without even having a license by being a helper to a licensee on Field Day or Contest Day. Field Day that I just mentioned is an event each summer where individual hams as well as clubs participate in simulations of operation on emergency power, thus in the field and off the grid. Field Day has points rewards for any club that presents information to the public, that is, unlicensed people. That would be a great way to taste of what the hobby can provide and meet a lot of great people in the process. To obtain a license of your own, you only need to pass a written exam, usually given at a local club meeting. Knowing how to send or receive Morse code is no longer a requirement for licensure, and the question pool can be found on the internet as well as practice exams. Finding a local club can be as easy as using Google, or check with your local American Red Cross chapter, as they work hand in hand with amateur radio in disaster times. Amateur radio may be an antiquated form of communication, but it has come a long way from the days of needing to know Morse code. It's losing bandwidth to some of the devices that its users helped pioneer, the ever-present cell phone and wireless Wi-Fi. Due to the importance of the emergency communications and the public services offered by amateur radio in general, the bandwidth already allocated to ham radio should be preserved at all costs.